Welcome to another WELS 175th anniversary video. Today we're speaking with Dr. John Brenner, formerly at Wisconsin Lutheran Seminary, and we're going to ask him today, what's one main event in WELS history that more people should know about?
Thank you, Pastor Phelps. I think one event that I would like to talk about anyway is really a defining moment in Wisconsin Synod history, and that would be the intersynodical controversy with the Missouri Synod, which eventually resulted in our termination of fellowship with that synod. Now, anyone who's old enough to remember when those things were happening will remember what a traumatic period of time that was for our synod. People had family members on both sides in both synods. And for a lot of that controversy, people in both synods really couldn't believe that something was happening in the Missouri Synod that was causing problems. The Missouri Synod, historically, about 7 times the size of the Wisconsin Synod, really had been the leading voice of confessional Lutheranism. Missouri was growing by leaps and bounds during this period of time. In 1929, they rejected the Chicago Theses, which had been an attempt to, resolve the election controversy because they said these theses were not specific enough. 1932, they adopted their synod's confession known as a brief statement. And everyone in the synodical conference recognized that as an orthodox statement of Christian doctrine. But then all of a sudden, about 1938, 1939, some changes occurred. The Missouri Synod started meeting with representatives of the American Lutheran Church, the ALC. Now, the ALC had been formed in 1930 by a merger of the Ohio, Iowa, and Buffalo synods, all of which had had historic doctrinal differences with the Missouri Synod. And when they met, they issued a statement that said the declaration of the representatives of the ALC together with Missouri's brief statement would form the basis for a future church union. Right away, our ears perked up in the Wisconsin Synod, and we sent out some warnings to them and said, wait a minute, you don't resolve doctrinal differences on the basis of 2 different statements. You need one statement with both thesis and antithesis to make sure that the doctrinal differences have really been resolved. Now, at the same time, the ALC had already expressed this statement that said it's neither necessary nor possible to agree in all non-fundamental doctrines. And they held out for, what they called a wholesome latitude of theological opinion. In other words, they were saying it's actually wholesome to agree to disagree on different doctrines. Well, things continued to progress. 1944, the Missouri Synod in the Saginaw Convention passed some historic resolutions, one of which made a distinction between joint prayer and prayer fellowship, departing from what had really been a synodical conference position, doctrinal position. They also adopted a statement called doctrinal affirmation, which in part was to meet our demand for one confession. The ALC never adopted, though, the doctrinal affirmation. They also, at that convention, left it up to individual congregations to determine whether they wanted to participate in the scouting movement in this country. Historically, the Missouri Synod and our synod had been opposed to the scouting movement for a number of reasons. Fellowship, a vague Christless God, work righteousness pervading that. And so, again, more people in the Wisconsin Synod started saying, what's going on in Missouri? We see some strange things happening. Well, these were addressed on the official level. They were addressed in meetings of the Synodical Conference in 1952. I believe it was a Synodical Conference meeting. President Brenner addressed the Synodical Conference expressing our Synod's concerns about what was happening in the Missouri Synod and issuing some admonitions and some warnings. And the Missouri Synod delegation actually vociferously booed him and almost shouted him down. Our delegation to that convention was so horrified by this that they huddled privately and came up with what was called an in statu confessionis declaration. They said, we are now in a state of confession over against the Missouri Synod. That really would be the last step before we would have to declare a severance of fellowship. Our 1953 convention also adopted that in statu confessionis declaration, and some at that time were already suggesting it's time to break with the Missouri Synod. 1955, in fact, at our convention, there was a resolution to break with the Missouri Synod, but that resolution was defeated. And one of the reasons was Missouri Synod was meeting only once every 3 years at that time, and they had not had any time to respond officially to our synodical conference, or synodical resolutions and warnings and admonitions. And so that resolution was defeated. Now, in the meantime, the Missouri Synod and the ALC had produced another document, the Common Confession, Part 1 and Part 2. And those things were discussed at a 1954 Synodical Conference convention. But all the essays did at that convention is show a really divided Synodical Conference. We and the Evangelical Lutheran Synod on one side, and the Missouri Synod and the Little Slovak Synod on the other side. At our 1956 convention, however, there seemed to be some things going in the right direction in Missouri. Now, our objections to the Common Confession were not so much what it said, but what it left unsaid. It really hadn't resolved the doctrinal differences with the ALC. Well, in 56, the Missouri Synod declared that the Common Confession would no longer function. The Missouri Synod thanked us for our concerns, our expression of concerns. So the Synod in convention, although we continued protesting fellowship, said, maybe we see some light at the end of the tunnel. 1957, we were meeting in recess conventions in those years to deal with all these issues. Once again, there was a resolution to break with the Missouri Synod, which did not carry the majority of the Synod delegates. President Rime of the Synod, who had also been kind of our point man in the discussions with the Missouri Synod, then resigned as seminary professor and resigned from that committee. Eventually, he will be one of the founding members of the CLC, the Church of the Lutheran Confessions. The 1957 convention, however, also said we need to have some final attempts to resolve these differences. One that was agreed upon was a conclave of theologians, which included theologians from church bodies around the world that we were in fellowship with. The other one was the joint union committee of the Synodical Conference, given a directive to attempt to draw up a common doctrinal statement to see if there still was unity, or to finally say, do doctrinal differences exist? That committee came up with an excellent statement on Scripture, which all the synods adopted. It also came up with a pretty good statement on the doctrine of the Antichrist, which our synod adopted. But they reached an impasse on the doctrine of fellowship, which showed on paper that we now had a doctrinal difference. And so that very next year, 1961, our synod and convention in Milwaukee resolved to suspend fellowship with the Lutheran Church Missouri Synod. That was not easily done. It was not a happy day for anyone in our synod, because a cherished fellowship of over 90 years was now ended. In 1963, the Wisconsin Synod and the ELS also withdrew from the Synodical Conference. Now, in the aftermath of our suspending fellowship, the liberals in the Missouri Synod became really more bold and much more visible. And eventually it became quite evident that there were a number of professors at Concordia St. Louis that were no longer teaching in accord with official Missouri Synod doctrine. And of course, we just recently celebrated the 50th anniversary of the kind of famous or infamous Seminex walkout, which occurred in February of 1974, when, attempts were made to deal with those who were in error. I happened to be a student at our seminary at that time in my first year, and one of the professors we had at the time was Dr. Sigbert Becker, who had come to us from the Missouri Synod, and he was really able to fill us in on a lot of things in the background and give us a pretty good understanding of what was going on, because really we were watching that in almost horror of what was happening to our former sister synod. Now in our synod, many as the break approached were very concerned, because they sort of predicted that if our synod broke with the Missouri Synod, it would pretty much be the end of our synod. But just the opposite happened. After we broke from with the Missouri Synod, we really entered what I kind of like to think of as a golden age in our synod's history of rapid mission expansion throughout the continental United States and into Alaska and Hawaii, a rapid world mission expansion, a rapid expansion in our ministerial education synod, our Lutheran elementary schools, our area Lutheran high schools. The dire predictions just did not come true. In fact, the opposite happened. The point is, God did bless what we did, but even if he had not done that with numerical or outward success, it still was ultimately the right thing for us to do. And recently, the Missouri Synod President Matthew Harrison addressed Synod Convention, I guess it was a couple years ago now, and he publicly stated that our synod was right in breaking with his synod when we did. And now, of course, he is trying to bring his synod back to what they were historically. This is really a defining event in our synod's history. You really cannot understand where the Wisconsin synod is today without at least understanding the basics that were going on in the intersynodical controversy.